Let's get a move on then and talk a little bit about the festive demand and segments that are showing strong growth when it comes to Technopak. We've got the management now joining in. Arvind Singhal is the chairman and managing director with us on the show live. Thank you so much for taking time out, Mr. Singhal. What about the current demand trends? How are you seeing the consumer trends as well right now in terms of the festive demand? Have you seen encouraging signs?
So let me give an answer by saying yes and no both. In the short term, when you look into the festive demand across a few categories, those few categories obviously are the ones which are consumer electronics, consumer durables, kitchen appliances, in a different segment, four-wheelers in particular. All of these actually give the impression that, look, perhaps the worst is behind us as far as consumption is concerned and the demand is back. Having said so, there are other categories which are much bigger in terms of the impact on the overall consumption basket of the consumers in India. And this is where I'm not very sure whether we can see across board, across all category demand bouncing back. In fact, the impact of lower incomes, job losses, is already beginning to be felt in this particular season. Two-wheelers being just one example of those. The sales of very, very big categories like clothing remain to be subdued. Even categories like footwear remain to be relatively subdued compared to what would have been expected. So it's a mixed bag. One would like to be very optimistic about the economy coming back on track. But so far, I think one has to examine very, very carefully which category is showing sign of bounce back and which categories are lagging behind.
Okay, so fairly encouraging then it seems, Mr. Singhal. And, what about the trigger, the fact that the government is likely to hike the DA of 4.8 MN along with the other recent boosts to increase more cash in consumers' hand? Do you think that that is likely to provide a more, a more decisive change in consumer spending patterns?
Impact, if any, would be absolutely negligible. Let me give you again some data to support it. The total merchandise private consumption is about $800 billion. And the total spending of consumers on services is another $800 billion. So we're talking about private spending of about $1,600 to $1,650 billion US dollars. If you look into the total amount of stimulus, the so-called stimulus 2, and maybe even the so-called stimulus 1, which at the best of estimates was no more than about 2,50,000 crores, which translates to roughly about $30 billion or so. Now, on a base of $1,615 billion, $1,650, what is $30 billion? And of that, bulk of that money was given out in the month of April and May itself. So unless we are talking in hundreds of billions of dollars of money being given to the customers to spend directly or indirectly, I think there is nothing like a stimulus as far as private spending is concerned, according to me. And therefore, we will not see any kind of an impact or absolutely very minimal impact of the so-called stimulus. And I'll actually emphasize the word so-called stimulus.
Fair enough. Mr. Singhal, okay, so let me just understand, from what you've said so far, you're actually saying that the so-called recovery is tepid, that particularly when it comes to the sort of smaller segments, for instance, two-wheelers, etc., which are lower budget segments, pardon me, that we're definitely seeing that lag with job losses and so forth. Now, the reason I'm probing you on this is because we just had a guest just before this talking about how the demand for luxury cars is spiking to never before seen levels. So just trying to understand the discrepancies here, you refer to the fact that different segments are behaving differently. But if we could just break that down a little further, because we are seeing mixed reports coming in, e-commerce sites that are claiming that, that segments like clothing are actually doing really well.
Okay. So again, I think it's about how you interpret data, and I'm using data in this case. The total contribution of e-commerce as a percentage of total consumer spending in India is still about 3%. 3%. You can put any kind of a growth number on this 3% consumer spending. It is not going to move the needle, so to say, as far as overall consumer spending is concerned. So one has to be very careful that if you're talking about growth for e-commerce players, most certainly because of COVID, it has seen a huge amount of a shift in favor of e-commerce for the people who are shopping online. So there is no disputing the data, if whatever the data might be on e-commerce. But if it is only 3% of the total consumer spending, you cannot extrapolate that to say that overall consumer spending in the country is seeing a big boost. So that is one point on e-commerce. Let's talk about the sales of luxury vehicles in India. Whichever way luxury is defined, the numbers last year were in the range of 50, 60,000 vehicles per year. Let us say this year they become 70,000 vehicles per year. What is the total value as a percentage of the total amount of business being done by two-wheelers and four-wheeler companies in the country? My submission would be that it will account for no more than about 3 to 4% of the total automobile market in the country. So even if that luxury segment has shown a sign of a growth, I think again the very, very low base of luxury spending in India and luxury vehicles in India will probably be good for the luxury car makers for sure. But it is not reflecting the status of the health for the automobile industry in general.
Okay, and understood. That does clarify things to quite an extent. On one hand, we're seeing a gradual reopening, but very limited footfalls. As we discussed, traction seems to remain online. On the other hand, we're starting to see, while some amount of salaries are being reinstated along with this gradual reopening, on the other hand, there are big fears of a second wave. People are not stepping out, so on and so forth. So what happens post-festive season? Because if there has been any optimism around a recovery, it's been primarily pinned on these couple of months. And with so much uncertainty currently in the air, do you really see, a case for things improving here on?
Unfortunately, I remain to be a bit concerned about the recovery part of it. Much as I would like to believe or hope that I am wrong in this case. So firstly, again, I'll go back to the point I made a short while ago. The recovery for the economy will mean that the spending across all segments of consumer spending, not only merchandise, but even services, they come back. So when I talk about services, domestic travel and tourism, hospitality, restaurant industry, such an important industry for the country. They have been badly decimated, as we know, over the last 8-9 months. And despite the opening, that industry continues to struggle. So yes, some amount of money which could have gone into spending on those services, consumers have it with them, and therefore that spending is being done on some categories of merchandise. But overall, we need to look into this $1,650 billion consumer spending which was there last year on merchandise and services. And unless we see growth in every segment or stabilization at least in every segment, we cannot say that the recovery is broad-based. It could be recovering for a particular sub-segment, like I just mentioned, consumer durables, electronics, but that doesn't mean that the whole economy is on the path to a sustained recovery. The point you made just now, that even the post-festive season, let's say post-Diwali season, unless consumers have extra money in their hands, I fail to understand that how the economy is going to come back to on its rails, and how would consumer spending sustain? Where is the pent-up demand in terms of where's the pent-up money to fulfill that demand, so to say? So if the money is not there in the hands of consumers at large, I'm not talking about the very affluent or the very rich, but across board, if the money is less in the hands of consumers, this recovery cannot be sustained. There is little money in the hands of the consumers today.
Understood, and good to hear the other side as well. Mr. Singhal, thanks so much for joining us this morning.